Billionaire abandons pregnant fiancée. 2 years later, he sees her at a charity event and is shocked. The numbers on his laptop screen should have made him smile, but Declan Hawthorne stared at them with the same empty expression he'd worn for the past 2 years. 12 billion. That's what his latest medical device patent had generated since the Swiss deal closed. 12 billion reasons why everyone called him a genius, a visionary, a man who could turn innovation into gold. Yet as he sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Hawthorne Medical Tower in Manhattan, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars, all he felt was the familiar hollow ache in his chest. His assistant knocked softly before entering. "Mr. Hawthorne? The car is waiting downstairs. The Children's Heart Foundation Gala starts in an hour." Declan closed the laptop without looking at her. "Cancel it, Vivian. Send a donation instead. Double whatever they were expecting. Sir, with respect, you're the keynote sponsor. Your absence would be noticed." He almost laughed. Everything he did was noticed these days. Every business move dissected by Forbes, every public appearance analyzed by financial journalists, hungry for the next big story. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that success had become his prison, and money, his most expensive mistake. "Fine." He stood, adjusting his charcoal suit jacket. "But I'm leaving after the speeches." The ride to the Plaza Hotel took 18 minutes through Friday evening traffic. 18 minutes of staring out tinted windows at couples walking hand in hand, parents pushing strollers, families heading home after normal days filled with normal problems. Once he'd dismissed that life as ordinary. Now he wondered if ordinary might have been enough. The gala was exactly what he'd expected. Crystal chandeliers, designer gowns, and the comfortable chatter of New York's elite writing checks to ease their consciences. Declan moved through the crowd like a ghost in an expensive suit, accepting congratulations and handshakes while his mind remained elsewhere. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced from the stage, "please welcome Dr. Charlotte Wells, head of pediatric cardiology at Mount Sinai Children's Hospital, who will share how tonight's donations directly impact the lives of our youngest patients." The name hit him like a physical blow. Charlotte. His eyes found the stage before his brain could process what was happening. And there she was, walking confidently toward the podium in a navy blue dress that hugged her figure elegantly. Her blonde hair was shorter now, styled in a professional bob that framed her face beautifully. She looked radiant, successful, completely self-possessed. And in her arms, she carried a little boy. Declan's breath caught in his throat. The child couldn't have been more than 2 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges and curious eyes that scanned the audience without fear. He wore a tiny bow tie and seemed completely comfortable in his mother's arms, occasionally reaching up to touch her face as she began to speak. 2 years ago, Charlotte's voice rang clear and strong through the ballroom, "I learned that the greatest gift we can give a child isn't money or opportunity. It's presence, being there when they need us most." The words felt aimed directly at his heart. Declan gripped his champagne glass tighter, his knuckles white against the crystal. As Charlotte continued her speech about hope and healing, the little boy in her arms turned his head, and for one impossible moment, his gaze seemed to land directly on Declan across the crowded room. Those eyes, even from a distance, even through the haze of 2 years and 1,000 regrets, Declan recognized something in that innocent face that made his world tilt off its axis. And in that moment, staring at the woman he'd abandoned and the child he'd never met, Declan Hawthorne realized that all his billions couldn't buy back the one thing he'd thrown away, the one thing that mattered most. Time moved like cold honey as Charlotte finished her speech, but Declan couldn't hear her words anymore, only the thundering of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. The applause that followed seemed to come from underwater. Guests around him clapped and murmured appreciation, but Declan remained frozen, watching as Charlotte stepped down from the stage with practiced grace, the little boy still secure in her arms. "Incredible woman, isn't she?" The voice beside him belonged to an older gentleman in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. Declan turned, struggling to focus. "Dr. Wells has revolutionized pediatric care in this city," the man continued, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. "Single mother, too. Raised that beautiful boy all on her own after some coward walked out during her pregnancy. Can you imagine? Abandoning a woman like that?" The words hit Declan like shards of glass. He set his champagne down on a nearby table, his hand trembling slightly. "Excuse me." He needed air. He needed space. He needed to think. But as he turned toward the exit, a small commotion near the silent auction tables caught his attention. The little boy, Lucas, his mind whispered the name he'd never spoken aloud, had apparently grown restless in his mother's arms, and was now being held by a young woman with kind eyes and auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. "Easy, sweetheart," the woman said softly, bouncing Lucas gently. "Mama's just talking to the nice people about the hospital." A babysitter, Declan realized. Or perhaps a nanny. She looked to be in her mid-20s, dressed modestly in a black dress that spoke of professionalism rather than fashion. There was something about her demeanor, patient, caring, completely focused on the child's comfort, that made Declan's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. This was Lucas's world, a world of gentle voices and caring hands, of stability built by women who had stepped up when he had stepped away. "Riley, I'm so sorry." Charlotte appeared at the young woman's side, reaching for her son. "I know he gets cranky when he's hungry." "No problem at all, Dr. Wells. We've got his snacks right here." Riley, so that was her name, patted a small bag slung over her shoulder. "Though I think someone's getting sleepy too." As if on cue, Lucas rubbed his eyes with tiny fists, letting out a soft yawn that made both women smile. Charlotte took him back into her arms, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "We should probably head home soon," Charlotte murmured, but her voice carried that particular exhaustion Declan remembered, the weight of trying to be everything to everyone. It was then that Lucas looked up, his dark eyes scanning the room with the curious attention of a 2-year-old, and once again his gaze seemed to find Declan through the crowd. This time, Declan didn't look away. The child tilted his head slightly, studying this stranger across the room with an intensity that seemed far too mature for his age. For a moment that stretched into eternity, father and son looked at each other, one seeing a face he'd never known, the other recognizing something he couldn't possibly understand. Then Lucas smiled. It wasn't the polite smile of a well-behaved child at a formal event. It was pure, unguarded joy, the kind of smile that could light up the darkest corners of a man's soul. And in that smile, Declan saw something that nearly brought him to his knees. He saw himself at 2 years old, in old photographs his mother had treasured. The same dark hair, the same curious eyes, the same crooked little grin that had always been the Hawthorne trademark. Charlotte. The name escaped his lips before he could stop it, barely audible over the gentle hum of conversation around them. But somehow, across the room, she heard it. Their eyes met for the first time in 2 years, and the look she gave him could have frozen fire. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years they stared at each other across the elegant ballroom. Charlotte's expression remained perfectly controlled, but Declan could see the storm brewing behind her green eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at him with love, now hardened into something that cut deeper than hatred. She said something to Riley, who immediately took Lucas and moved toward the coat check area. Smart girl, Declan thought distantly. She could sense the approaching hurricane. Charlotte walked toward him with the measured steps of a surgeon approaching a delicate operation. Everything about her posture screamed professional composure, but Declan knew her well enough to recognize the tension in her shoulders, the slight tightening around her eyes. When she stopped in front of him, close enough that he could catch the faint scent of her perfume, something different now, more mature, she tilted her head slightly and spoke in a voice that could have cut glass. "Good evening, Mr. Hawthorne." The formal address hit him like a slap. "How surprising to see you at an event focused on children's welfare." The words were perfectly polite, delivered with a smile that would fool anyone watching from a distance. But Declan heard the steel beneath the silk, the carefully controlled fury that 2 years hadn't been enough to cool. "Charlotte, Dr. Wells," she corrected smoothly. "I think we should maintain appropriate boundaries, don't you? Given the circumstances." He deserved that. He deserved much worse. "You look," he struggled for words that wouldn't sound inadequate. "You look incredible. Success suits you." A bitter laugh escaped her lips, so quiet only he could hear it. "Success? Is that what you call it? Rebuilding your entire life from scratch while pregnant and alone? Learning to be both mother and father to a child whose own father decided he wasn't worth staying for?" Each word landed like a physical blow, but Declan forced himself to take it, to listen, to finally hear the cost of the choice he'd made. "I know you hate me," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "I know I don't deserve even this conversation, but Charlotte, Dr. Wells, I need you to know that not a day has passed that I haven't—" "Stop." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried enough force to silence him completely. "Don't you dare try to make this about your guilt. Don't you dare try to turn your regret into something I need to help you carry." She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was steadier, colder. You made your choice, Declan. You chose your Swiss contract over your family. You chose your precious timeline over our child. You chose to walk away when things got complicated because that's what you do. You solve problems by eliminating variables. The accuracy of her words was devastating. That's exactly how he'd thought about it, like a problem to be solved, a complication to be managed. He'd treated the pregnancy like a spreadsheet entry that didn't fit his 5-year plan. That's not. He started to protest, then stopped, because it was exactly that. You're right. The admission seemed to surprise her. Her carefully maintained composure flickered for just a moment. I was a coward, he continued, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I told myself it was logic, that it was about timing and responsibility. But the truth is I was terrified, and instead of facing that fear, I ran. Charlotte's jaw tightened. And now? What's different now, Declan? Why are you here? Before he could answer, Lucas's laughter rang out from across the room where Riley was letting him play with the ribbons from a gift bag. The sound drew both their gazes, and Declan watched Charlotte's entire demeanor soften as she looked at her son. Their son. He's beautiful, Declan said, the words barely audible. Charlotte turned back to him, and for just a moment her mask slipped entirely. The pain he saw there, raw, unhealed, profound, nearly brought him to his knees. His name is Lucas, she said simply. Lucas Wells. And he is everything to me. The emphasis on the last name wasn't lost on him. The child carried her name, her legacy, her strength. Nothing of Declan remained in that little boy's identity. Charlotte, please. Can we talk? Really talk? Not here, but somewhere. No. The word was final, absolute. There is nothing to discuss. You made your decision 2 years ago. I made mine when I chose to keep our baby and raise him alone. Those decisions don't get unmade because you're feeling nostalgic at a charity gala. She started to turn away, then paused. But I will say this, if you're thinking of disrupting our lives now, if you're thinking of playing the repentant father because it fits some new narrative you've created for yourself, think again. Lucas doesn't need a father who shows up when it's convenient. He needs consistency, stability, love that doesn't come with conditions or timelines. Her eyes met his one final time, and what he saw there made his chest tighten with a pain he'd forgotten was possible. He already has all of that from me. Declan stood motionless in the center of the ballroom for a full minute after Charlotte walked away, watching as she collected Lucas from Riley and moved toward the exit with the fluid efficiency of a woman who had learned to navigate the world alone. The conversations around him continued. Champagne glasses clinked, and life moved forward as if his entire universe hadn't just shifted on its axis. But inside his chest, something had cracked open, something that had been sealed shut for 2 years with ambition and willful ignorance. Sir, are you all right? Vivian's voice seemed to come from very far away. His assistant had appeared at his elbow, concern creasing her usually composed features. The car, he managed, his voice hoarse. Have them bring the car around. The ride back to his penthouse in Tribeca passed in a blur of city lights and honking traffic. Declan stared out the window, seeing not the familiar streets of Manhattan, but the ghost of a conversation that had taken place 2 years ago in the marble kitchen of his old apartment. I'm pregnant. 2 words that had sent his carefully ordered world spinning out of control. Are you sure? Such a stupid question. Charlotte had been a doctor. Of course she was sure. But his mind had immediately started calculating. The Swiss pharmaceutical deal, the board meetings, the 18-month timeline he'd mapped out for global expansion. This changes everything, he'd said, already reaching for his phone to check his calendar. It doesn't have to, she'd replied, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. We can make this work, Declan. People have been having babies and building careers simultaneously for centuries. But he'd already been mentally restructuring his 5-year plan, moving pieces around like a chess game where human emotions were inconvenient variables. The timing is impossible, Charlotte. This deal with Zurich Pharmaceuticals, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'll be traveling constantly for the next 1.5 years. A baby needs stability, consistency. How can I provide that? When I'm building an empire? She'd looked at him then, with something that might have been pity. You mean, how can a baby fit into your empire? She'd said quietly. Those aren't the same thing, Declan. The memory dissolved as his driver pulled up to his building. Declan rode the private elevator to the 45th floor in silence. his reflection in the polished steel doors showing a man who looked successful and empty in equal measure. His penthouse was exactly as he'd left it that morning, pristine, modern, and utterly sterile. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the Hudson River, and the minimalist furniture spoke of a man who valued function over comfort. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. Everything except the small velvet box hidden in his desk drawer. Declan found himself standing in front of his home office, staring at the mahogany desk where he'd made the decision that had cost him everything that mattered. Slowly, as if moving through water, he opened the bottom drawer and retrieved the box he hadn't touched in 2 years. Inside, the engagement ring he'd chosen for Charlotte caught the lamplight, a simple solitaire diamond that had seemed perfect for her understated elegance. He'd planned to propose after the Swiss deal closed, had even imagined the moment. Candlelight, champagne, her eyes lighting up with joy. Instead, he'd given her abandonment and silence. His phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer about tomorrow's merger meeting, then another from his publicist about a Forbes interview. The machinery of his success continued to turn, demanding his attention, his presence, his focus. But for the first time in 2 years, Declan Hawthorne ignored them all. He walked to his kitchen and opened a bottle of whiskey, the good stuff, 25 years old and smooth as silk. He poured 2 fingers into a crystal glass and sat down on his leather sofa, staring out at the city that had given him everything he thought he wanted. His laptop sat closed on the coffee table, containing spreadsheets and projections that proved his net worth had tripled since he'd walked away from Charlotte. His phone held contacts of the most powerful people in America, all eager to do business with the golden boy of medical innovation. But his apartment had never felt more like a mausoleum. The whiskey burned going down, but not as much as the memory of Lucas's smile, not as much as the look in Charlotte's eyes when she'd said their son's name with such fierce protectiveness. Lucas Wells, not Lucas Hawthorne. The child would grow up not knowing his father existed, would learn to tie his shoes and ride a bike and throw a baseball without ever wondering why Dad wasn't there to teach him, because Dad had chosen a boardroom in Switzerland over a nursery in New York. Declan closed his eyes and let the silence of his perfect, empty life wash over him. Somewhere across the city, Charlotte was probably reading Lucas a bedtime story, or singing him to sleep, or doing any of the 1,000 small things that made up the life Declan had forfeited. And for the first time since he'd signed that Swiss contract, Declan Hawthorne wondered if he'd made the worst deal of his life. 3 weeks passed before Declan found the courage to drive by Mount Sinai Children's Hospital. He told himself it was coincidence. His driver had taken a different route to avoid traffic, nothing more. But as the familiar brick building came into view, with its cheerful murals of cartoon animals painted along the pediatric wing, he found himself asking David to pull over. "Just for a moment," he said, ignoring his driver's curious glance in the rearview mirror. The hospital's main entrance buzzed with activity. Parents carried children with colorful casts, medical staff moved with purposeful efficiency, and somewhere in that building, Charlotte was probably saving lives with the same gentle competence she'd once brought to their relationship. A small sign near the entrance caught his attention. Weekly Reading Circle, Pediatric Ward, Fridays, 3 p.m., volunteers. Welcome. Volunteers welcome. That night, Declan found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. Research that had nothing to do with stock prices or pharmaceutical patents. He spent hours reading about childhood literacy programs, about the healing power of storytelling for sick children, about the simple act of reading aloud and its impact on young minds. By morning, he'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible a month ago. "Vivian," he said, catching his assistant as she arrived with his usual espresso and daily briefings, "cancel my afternoon meetings on Fridays. All of them." She nearly dropped her tablet. "Sir? All of them? Even the quarterly reviews with all of them?" He was already reaching for his phone. "And get me the contact information for Mount Sinai's volunteer coordinator." 2 days later, Declan Hawthorne, billionaire CEO who commanded boardrooms across 3 continents, found himself sitting in a cramped office in the hospital's basement, filling out volunteer application forms. "Any experience with children?" asked Mrs. Brennan, the volunteer coordinator, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every type of do-gooder come through her doors. "None," Declan admitted, "but I'm willing to learn." She studied him over her reading glasses. "Most of our corporate volunteers last about 3 weeks. Big hearts, busy schedules. These kids need consistency, Mr. Hawthorne. They need people who show up. I understand. Do you? She leaned back in her chair. These aren't networking opportunities or photo ops. These are sick children who've already been disappointed by too many adults. If you're going to start this, you better be prepared to finish it. Something in her tone reminded him of Charlotte, that fierce protectiveness, that willingness to challenge anyone who might hurt the vulnerable. I'll be here every Friday, he said simply, for as long as you'll have me. His first reading session was a disaster. Declan sat in a circle of tiny chairs in the pediatric playroom, surrounded by 8 children ranging in age from 4 to 10. Half of them were attached to IV poles, 2 wore colorful headscarves, and one little girl named Penny kept correcting his pronunciation of character names in the book he'd chosen. That's not how you say Hermione, she informed him with the patience of someone far older than her 7 years. And you're reading too fast. Story time is supposed to be slow and cozy. Slow and cozy. When was the last time Declan had done anything slowly? He adjusted his pace, softened his voice, and discovered something remarkable. Children were the most honest audience he'd ever encountered. They didn't care about his net worth or his business acumen. They cared whether he could make the dragon in the story sound properly fierce, whether he remembered that Tommy preferred adventure books while Penny liked fairy tales. After the session, as he was helping stack the tiny chairs, he heard a familiar voice in the hallway. Riley, could you grab Lucas's jacket from the car? I think it's going to rain. Declan's hands stilled on the chair he was holding. Through the playroom's glass door, he caught a glimpse of Charlotte walking past with purpose, her white coat billowing behind her. She didn't look in his direction, didn't even pause, but for a moment, he felt her presence like a physical force. Dr. Wells is wonderful, Mrs. Brennan said quietly, appearing beside him. She started the reading program, you know, said her own son loves stories, and she wanted other children to have that same joy even when they're stuck in hospital beds. Declan set down the chair carefully. Her son? Sweet little boy. He comes with her sometimes when her babysitter can't watch him. The kids adore him. He's like their little mascot. The image hit him like a punch to the chest. Lucas playing with sick children, bringing them joy simply by being the healthy, happy child they all wanted to be. Charlotte raising a son who naturally shared his mother's gift for healing. Mr. Hawthorne? Mrs. Brennan was studying him with sharp eyes. You look like you've seen a ghost. In a way, he had. He'd seen the ghost of the father he might have been. The man who could have been part of something beautiful instead of building an empire in isolation. Same time next week? He asked, his voice rougher than he intended. She nodded slowly. Same time next week. And Mr. Hawthorne, you did good today. Penny's been asking for weeks when the dragon voice man would come back. As Declan walked toward the elevator, he passed the pediatric cardiology wing. Through an open doorway, he caught a glimpse of Charlotte bent over a chart, her brow furrowed in concentration as she made notes. She looked tired but determined, completely absorbed in caring for her patients. He didn't stop, didn't try to get her attention. Instead, he kept walking, carrying with him the knowledge that for 1 hour each week, he was starting to understand what it meant to show up, not as a CEO or a billionaire or a man with something to prove. Just as someone who was finally learning that the most important things in life couldn't be scheduled or strategized. They could only be lived, one small moment at a time. By his 6th Friday at Mount Sinai, Declan had learned that Tommy liked books about space explorers, that Penny insisted on happy endings, and that 4-year-old Marcus would only sit still for stories if he could hold the book while Declan read. He'd also learned that children had an uncanny ability to see through pretense. Why are you sad? Penny asked one afternoon, studying his face with the directness that only children possessed. They'd just finished reading about a princess who'd found her way home, and the other kids were choosing books for next week. I'm not sad, Declan replied automatically, then caught himself. These children deserved honesty, not corporate deflection. Actually, I guess I am a little sad. Why? The simple question hung in the air. How could he explain to a 7-year-old that he'd traded everything meaningful for numbers on a screen? That he'd walked away from love because he was afraid it would complicate his perfectly ordered life? I made a mistake once, he said carefully. A big one. And now I'm trying to figure out how to make it right. Penny nodded as if this made perfect sense. My mom says mistakes are just practice for doing better next time. Before Declan could respond to this profound wisdom, the playroom door opened and Riley walked in, carrying a familiar small figure, Lucas. Declan's breath caught as he watched Charlotte's son toddle into the room with the confident curiosity of a 2-year-old who knew he was loved. He wore tiny jeans and a striped sweater, his dark hair slightly mussed from what had probably been a nap in his car seat. "Sorry we're late," Riley said to Mrs. Brennan, who was organizing books on a nearby shelf. Someone refused to wake up from his nap. The children immediately brightened at Lucas's arrival. Even though he was too young to understand the stories, they'd clearly adopted him as their mascot. Penny scooted over to make room on her tiny chair, and Tommy offered him a stuffed elephant from the toy bin. "Lucas," Marcus called out, his face lighting up with pure joy. Declan watched from across the room as Lucas giggled and clapped his hands, basking in the attention of his older admirers. The sound of his laughter was like sunlight breaking through clouds, pure, uncomplicated happiness that filled every corner of the space. Riley settled into a chair with the easy competence Declan had observed at the gala. She kept a watchful eye on Lucas while engaging with the other children, asking about their books and listening to their excited chatter about story time. "Are you the dragon voice man?" she asked suddenly, turning to Declan. He blinked, realizing he'd been caught staring. "I'm sorry? Penny's been talking about the dragon voice man for weeks. Dr. Wells mentioned that someone new had been volunteering for story time." Her smile was warm but curious. "I'm Riley, by the way, Lucas's babysitter." "Declan," he managed, his throat suddenly dry. "And yes, I suppose I am the dragon voice man." Lucas chose that moment to toddle over to where Declan was sitting, drawn perhaps by the sound of his voice. He stopped directly in front of Declan's chair and looked up with those dark eyes that were so familiar, yet completely new. "Hi," Lucas said with the simple confidence of a child who expected the world to be friendly. Declan's heart stopped entirely. "Hi there." For a moment that stretched into eternity, father and son looked at each other. Lucas tilted his head, studying Declan with the same intense curiosity he'd shown at the gala. Then with the unpredictability of a toddler, he held up his hands. "Up?" The request was so innocent, so trusting that Declan felt his eyes burn. This child, his child, was asking to be held by a stranger because his world was full of safe adults who could be trusted. "Lucas, honey, let Mr. Declan finish cleaning up," Riley said gently, starting to rise from her chair. "It's okay," Declan said quickly, his voice rougher than he intended. He looked down at Lucas, who was still waiting patiently with his arms raised. "Would you like me to pick you up?" Lucas nodded enthusiastically. With hands that trembled slightly, Declan lifted his son for the first time. Lucas was heavier than he'd expected, solid and warm and real in his arms. He smelled like baby shampoo and something sweet, maybe the crackers Riley kept in her bag for snacks. "Book?" Lucas asked hopefully, pointing to the stack on the nearby table. "You want me to read you a story?" Another enthusiastic nod. Declan chose a simple board book about farm animals and settled back in his chair with Lucas on his lap. As he began to read, pointing to pictures of cows and chickens, Lucas leaned back against his chest with complete trust. The feeling was overwhelming. This small person fitting perfectly in his arms, listening intently to every word, occasionally reaching up to pat Declan's face with tiny hands that carried the scent of graham crackers. "Moo," Lucas said seriously when they reached the page with the cow. "That's right," Declan whispered. "Cows say moo." From across the room he caught Riley watching them with a thoughtful expression. She didn't seem alarmed or suspicious, just observant in the way of someone whose job was to notice things about the children in her care. They finished the book, and Lucas immediately pointed to another one. "More stories," Declan confirmed, reaching for a book about trucks. As they read together, Declan found himself memorizing everything. The weight of Lucas in his arms, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the serious concentration he gave to each picture. This was his son, brilliant and beautiful and completely unaware that the man holding him had walked away before he was born. When Charlotte's voice echoed from the hallway, discussing discharge procedures with another doctor, Lucas perked up immediately. "Mama," he said with absolute certainty, starting to squirm in Declan's arms. "Let's go find Mama," Riley said, standing and reaching for Lucas. As she lifted him away, Lucas looked back at Declan with those serious dark eyes. "Bye-bye," he said, waving a chubby hand. "Bye-bye, Lucas," Declan managed. After they left, the playroom felt impossibly quiet. Declan sat in the tiny chair for a long time, staring at the board book about farm animals and trying to process what had just happened. He'd held his son. He'd read him stories. For 20 minutes he'd gotten a glimpse of what fatherhood might feel like. Not the abstract concept he'd feared 2 years ago, but the real, immediate joy of making a small person smile. And somewhere in the hospital corridors above, Charlotte continued her work, unaware that her carefully separated worlds had just collided in the most beautiful way possible. That night, Declan couldn't sleep. He lay in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse while the city hummed 45 floors below. But instead of the familiar view of Manhattan's skyline, all he could see were Lucas's trusting dark eyes, and the way his small body had fit so perfectly against his chest. The weight of 20 minutes had somehow become heavier than 2 years of regret. By 3 a.m., he was in his home office. But instead of reviewing quarterly reports, he found himself researching child development milestones. What words should a 2-year-old know? What games did they enjoy? How many books was too many for bedtime? Questions he should have been asking 2 years ago flooded his mind with urgent intensity. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to his office. Mr. Hawthorne? Vivian's voice came through the intercom, unusually hesitant. There's a young woman here to see you. Says her name is Riley Martinez. She doesn't have an appointment, but she insists it's important. Declan's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. Riley, Lucas's babysitter. Send her in. Riley walked into his corner office looking exactly as she had at the hospital. Composed, observant, and completely unintimated by the floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive artwork that usually impressed visitors. She wore jeans and a simple cardigan, her auburn hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail. Ms. Martinez. Declan stood, gesturing to the chairs across from his desk. This is unexpected. I'm sure it is. She settled into the chair with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything. I won't take much of your time, Mr. Hawthorne. I just have a few questions. Something in her tone made Declan's chest tighten. This wasn't a social call. Would you like coffee, water? I'm fine, thank you. Riley folded her hands in her lap and looked at him directly. How long have you been volunteering at Mount Sinai? The question seemed innocent enough, but Declan sensed dangerous currents beneath the surface. About 6 weeks. Why? 6 weeks. She nodded thoughtfully. Right around the time Dr. Wells mentioned she'd seen someone she knew at the Children's Heart Foundation gala. Declan's blood turned to ice. How much did she know? How much had Charlotte told her? I've been working for Dr. Wells since Lucas was 3 months old, Riley continued, her voice conversational but her eyes sharp. I've watched her build a life for herself and her son that's stable, peaceful, and safe. I've seen how hard she's worked to create that stability. Ms. Martinez. I've also seen how Lucas responds to male figures. She interrupted gently but firmly. He's a social little boy, but he's never asked a stranger to pick him up before yesterday. Never been that immediately comfortable with someone he'd just met. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Declan could feel his carefully constructed defenses crumbling under her steady gaze. What exactly are you asking me? Riley leaned forward slightly. I'm asking if you're the reason Dr. Wells sometimes gets that look in her eyes when she thinks no one is watching. The reason she still flinches when certain songs come on the radio. The reason she works twice as hard as any other doctor in that hospital, like she's trying to prove something to herself. Each word hit like a physical blow. Riley, I'm asking if you're Lucas's father. The silence that followed was deafening. Through his office windows, Declan could see the city going about its normal business. People in other buildings conducting meetings, traffic flowing through the streets below, life continuing as if his world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Why? He finally asked. Why does it matter to you? Because I love that little boy like he's my own, Riley said simply. Because I've spent 2 years watching his mother put herself back together piece by piece. And because if you think you can waltz back into their lives when it's convenient for you, you're wrong. Her words echoed Charlotte's from the gala, but there was something different in Riley's tone. Not anger exactly, but a fierce protectiveness that reminded Declan of a lioness guarding her cubs. That's not, he struggled to find the right words. I'm not trying to disrupt anything. I just wanted to help, to contribute something meaningful. By volunteering at the hospital where she works? By reading stories to children in the program she created? Riley's eyebrows rose. That's quite a coincidence, don't you think? Declan ran a hand through his hair, feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with corporate vulnerability. You're right. It wasn't a coincidence. I know. But I wasn't trying to manipulate anything. I needed to understand what I'd given up, what I'd lost. Riley studied him for a long moment, and Declan had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing straight through to his soul. Lucas asked about you after we left, she said quietly. He kept saying bookman and looking toward the door like he expected you to follow us home. The words hit Declan like a punch to the chest. He did? Children that age form attachments quickly. They trust easily because they haven't learned to be afraid yet. Riley's voice grew harder. That trust is precious, Mr. Hawthorne. It's not something you get to play with. I would never. Wouldn't you? She stood, slinging her purse over her shoulder. Because from where I'm sitting, that's exactly what you did 2 years ago. You played with Dr. Wells's trust, and with the future of a child who didn't even exist yet. Declan rose as well, desperate to make her understand. I was different then. I was scared and selfish, and I made the worst mistake of my life, but I'm not that man anymore. Riley paused at his office door, her hand on the handle. Prove it. How? Stop hiding behind volunteer work and anonymous donations. If you want to be part of their lives, be honest about who you are and what you want. Dr. Wells deserves the truth, and Lucas deserves better than a father who shows up in disguise. She opened the door, then looked back one final time. But know this, if you hurt them again, if you disappear when things get complicated or inconvenient, you'll answer to me. And I promise you, Mr. Hawthorne, I'm a lot less forgiving than Dr. Wells. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Declan alone with the weight of her words and the realization that his carefully anonymous approach to redemption had just been completely demolished. Riley Martinez had just called his bluff, and somehow he knew she was right. Riley's words echoed in Declan's mind for 3 sleepless days. Stop hiding behind volunteer work and anonymous donations. She was right. He'd been trying to earn forgiveness through the back door, hoping that somehow good deeds would erase the magnitude of his abandonment. But redemption, he was beginning to understand, required something much harder than charity. It required courage. On Tuesday morning, instead of heading to his office, Declan found himself sitting in his car outside a small coffee shop in Brooklyn Heights, the kind of place Charlotte had always loved, with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. According to the hospital directory, she lived 6 blocks away. He'd been there for an hour, nursing the same cup of coffee and watching the morning rush through the window, when he saw her. Charlotte walked past the window pushing a stroller, her blonde hair catching the October sunlight. She wore scrubs under a light jacket and carried herself with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to navigate the world as a single mother. Lucas sat contentedly in his stroller, pointing at pigeons and babbling in the nonsensical language of toddlers. They looked complete, happy, like a perfect unit that had never needed anyone else. Declan's phone buzzed with yet another message from his assistant about the morning's canceled meetings, but he ignored it. For the first time in his professional life, there was something more important than business. He waited until Charlotte disappeared around the corner, presumably heading to the subway station. Then he made a decision that would have terrified him 6 weeks ago. He called her. Charlotte's phone rang 4 times before she answered, slightly breathless. Dr. Wells. Charlotte, it's Declan. The words came out rushed before he could lose his nerve. Please don't hang up. Silence. He could hear the city sounds around her. Traffic, distant voices, the rumble of a subway train. How did you get this number? Her voice was carefully controlled, professional. That's not important. What's important is that I need to see you. To talk to you. Really talk. We talked at the gala. I thought I made myself clear. You did. But things have changed. Another pause. What things? Declan closed his eyes, taking a breath that felt like jumping off a cliff. I met our son. The silence that followed was so complete he wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. What do you mean you met him? At the hospital. During story time. I've been volunteering there for the past 6 weeks. And last Friday, Riley brought Lucas to the reading circle. He asked me to pick him up. We read books together. You've been volunteering at my hospital? The professional control was cracking now, revealing something raw underneath. For 6 weeks? Yes. Why? The simple question contained multitudes of pain, confusion, and anger. Declan gripped his phone tighter. Because I needed to understand what I'd thrown away. Because I needed to see the world you'd built without me. Because I've spent 2 years trying to convince myself I made the right choice and I couldn't do it anymore. He could hear her breathing, quick and shallow. Charlotte, please. Give me 1 hour. 1 conversation. If you never want to see me again after that, I'll respect it. I'll stop volunteering, I'll stay out of your life completely. But I need you to know that I understand now. I understand what I lost. Lucas doesn't know who you are, she said suddenly, her voice fierce with protection. He doesn't know he has a father. I won't have you confusing him or... I know. Riley made that very clear when she came to my office yesterday. She what? Charlotte's voice shot up an octave. Riley came to your office? She figured it out. She's very protective of you both and very smart. A bitter laugh escaped Charlotte's lips. Of course she did. She always was too observant for her own good. She loves Lucas. And she loves you. That much was obvious. She's family, Charlotte said simply. The family I chose when the family I thought I had disappeared. The words cut deep, but Declan accepted them. He deserved them. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, he said quietly. I know I forfeited that right when I walked away, but I'm asking anyway. 1 hour, Charlotte, please. The pause stretched so long he began to think she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was tired. There's a park on Remsen Street, Brooklyn Heights Promenade. Do you know it? I'll find it. Tonight, 7 o'clock. Riley will be with Lucas, so don't. She took a shaky breath. Don't expect to see him. This is between us. I understand. And Declan. Her voice hardened again. If this is some kind of game, if you're doing this because you're bored or guilty or trying to check something off your redemption list, walk away now. I've built a good life for my son. Don't you dare destroy it because you're having a midlife crisis. The line went dead. Declan sat in his car for another 20 minutes, staring at his phone and trying to process what had just happened. In 12 hours, he would face the woman he'd abandoned. He would have to explain the inexplicable, justify the unjustifiable. He would have to tell the truth about why he'd run and why he'd come back. For the first time in his life, Declan Hawthorne was about to enter a negotiation where he had absolutely nothing to offer and everything to lose. And somehow, that felt exactly right. As he finally started his car and pulled into traffic, heading back to Manhattan to figure out what he was going to say, one thought kept echoing in his mind. Lucas had asked for the bookman after they left. His son, their son, had wanted to see him again. That had to count for something. It had to. The Brooklyn Heights Promenade stretched along the East River like a ribbon of peace in the chaos of New York City. At 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in October, the setting sun painted the Manhattan skyline in shades of gold and amber, and couples walked hand in hand along the tree-lined path. Declan arrived 15 minutes early and found Charlotte already there. She sat alone on a bench facing the water, her posture rigid with tension despite the serene setting. She'd changed out of her scrubs into jeans and a cream-colored sweater, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders in a style that reminded him painfully of the woman he'd fallen in love with 3 years ago. But everything else about her was different, stronger, more self-contained. She looked like someone who'd walked through fire and emerged not just intact, but refined by the experience. Charlotte. She turned at the sound of his voice, and for a moment, seeing her face in the golden light, Declan forgot how to breathe. She was still beautiful, perhaps more beautiful than before, but there was a wariness in her green eyes that hadn't been there when they were together. You came, she said simply. Did you think I wouldn't? A bitter smile touched her lips. I've learned not to count on you showing up when you say you will. The words hit their mark, but Declan accepted them without flinching. He gestured to the empty space beside her on the bench. May I? She nodded, moving slightly to give him room while maintaining careful distance between them. For several minutes they sat in silence, watching a ferry make its way across the darkening water. The city lights were beginning to twinkle to life, and somewhere in the distance, a street musician played violin with haunting beauty. He looks like you, Charlotte said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the evening breeze. Declan's heart clenched. I know. Those eyes, that stubborn set to his jaw when he doesn't get his way, even the way he concentrates when he's figuring something out. She turned to look at him directly. It was like seeing a ghost. I'm sorry. I never meant for you to see me there. Never meant to. Why? The question cut through his apology like a blade. Why the hospital? Why story time? Why now? Declan had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in his head, had prepared careful explanations and rational justifications. But sitting here beside her, watching the pain flicker across her face, all his practiced words crumbled into dust. Because I was dying inside, he said simply. Because every success felt hollow. Every achievement felt meaningless. Because I realized that I'd traded the most important thing in my life for numbers on a spreadsheet. Charlotte's laugh was sharp, humorless. And it only took you 2 years to figure that out? No. Declan turned to face her fully. I knew it the day I left. I knew it when I got on that plane to Switzerland. I knew it every single day for 2 years. But I was too proud and too scared to admit I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Scared of what? Her voice rose slightly. the careful control beginning to crack. Scared of responsibility? Scared of having to put someone else's needs before your own? Scared of failing? The admission tore from his throat like a physical wound. Scared of being the kind of father my own father was. Absent, distracted, more interested in building an empire than building a relationship with his son. Charlotte stared at him, something shifting in her expression. My father missed every important moment of my childhood, Declan continued, the words coming faster now, like water through a broken dam. Every birthday, every school play, every moment when I needed him to just be there. He was always working, always traveling, always chasing the next big deal. And when he died, the only thing he left me was money, and the knowledge that success meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. He ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the right words. When you told me you were pregnant, all I could think about was how I was just like him, how I was already married to my work, already obsessed with building something bigger than myself. And I thought Lucas would be better off without a father than with one who would inevitably disappoint him. So you made that choice for all of us. Charlotte's voice was deadly quiet. You decided what was best for our son without even giving yourself a chance to be different. Yes, the word came out as barely a whisper. And I was wrong. I was so wrong, Charlotte. I thought I was protecting him from disappointment, but I was really just protecting myself from the possibility of failure. Tears gleamed in Charlotte's eyes, but her voice remained steady. Do you have any idea what it was like? Finding out I was pregnant and feeling nothing but joy, then having to watch that joy die in your eyes? Having to see you calculate whether our baby was worth disrupting your precious 5-year plan? Each word was a dagger to his heart, but Declan forced himself to listen, to really hear the pain he'd caused. I wanted to hate you, she continued, her voice breaking slightly. It would have been easier to hate you, but I couldn't, because I knew you were scared. I could see it even when you were trying to convince both of us that this was about logic and timing. I should have stayed. I should have fought through the fear instead of running from it. Yes, you should have. Charlotte wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. But you didn't, and Lucas and I survived without you. We more than survived. We thrived. We built something beautiful. I know. I can see that. He's incredible, Charlotte. Happy and confident and so smart. You did that. You gave him everything he needed. We gave him everything he needed, she corrected softly. Riley and I. The nurses at the hospital who helped when I was working double shifts. Mrs. Chen from downstairs who watches him when Riley's sick. It takes a village, Declan. And you chose not to be part of that village. The words hung between them as the last light faded from the sky and the city transformed into a constellation of electric stars. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, Declan said finally. I know I have no right to ask for a second chance, but I need you to know that these past 6 weeks, reading to those children, seeing the world you've built, it's changed me. Not just made me realize what I lost, but shown me who I could be. Charlotte was quiet for so long that Declan began to think she wouldn't respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful, considering. Lucas asked Riley about the bookman every day this week. He keeps looking for you at story time. Declan's breath caught. Riley told me. She also told me she went to your office, that she confronted you. She was protecting you, both of you. I respect that. She said you seemed different, not like the man she expected based on my descriptions. Charlotte turned to study his face in the lamplight. She said you seemed broken. I am broken, Declan admitted. I broke myself when I walked away from you, from us, and I've spent 2 years trying to put the pieces back together, but they don't fit the same way anymore. A long silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sounds of the city and the gentle lapping of water against the promenade's edge. I can't go back, Declan, Charlotte said finally. I can't be the woman I was before, the one who believed in fairy tales and happy endings. That woman died when you left. Declan felt his heart shatter completely. I understand. But, she continued, and the single word contained enough hope to resurrect the dead, I might be willing to meet the woman I am now, the mother who puts her son's needs first, the woman who believes in second chances but only for people who've truly earned them. Declan hardly dared to breathe. What does that mean? Charlotte stood wrapping her sweater tighter around herself against the evening chill. It means that if you want to be part of Lucas's life, really part of it, not just a weekend visitor or a guilty conscience making donations, you're going to have to prove you can show up, every day, even when it's hard, even when it's boring, even when there's no Swiss contract or billion-dollar deal to tempt you away. She paused, looking out at the water one last time before meeting his eyes. It means we start over, not as the people we were, but as the people we are now. It means you get to know your son and he gets to know his father, but slowly, carefully, with his needs, not yours, coming first. Declan stood as well, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. And us? He asked quietly. Charlotte's smile was sad but not without warmth. There is no us right now. There's just a man who wants to be a father and a woman who's willing to let him try. Everything else? We'll see. As she walked away, her footsteps echoing on the promenade, Declan remained by the water, watching her figure disappear into the Brooklyn night. For the first time in 2 years, he had hope. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. 3 months later, Declan sat cross-legged on the floor of Charlotte's small but cozy apartment in Brooklyn Heights, helping Lucas build a tower out of colorful blocks. The living room was a study in organized chaos. Medical journals stacked neatly beside picture books, a toy chest overflowing with trucks and stuffed animals, and crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator with the pride of place usually reserved for diplomas. It was nothing like his sterile penthouse. It was perfect. "Higher, Daddy," Lucas commanded with the authority of someone who had recently learned the word and discovered its power. Daddy. Even after 2 months of hearing it, the word still hit Declan like a physical force, filling his chest with a warmth that no business success had ever provided. "How high should we make it?" Declan asked, carefully placing another block on their precariously tall structure. "To the ceiling," Lucas giggled, stretching his arms up as high as his 2-year-old frame would allow. "Well, that might be a little ambitious," Charlotte said from the kitchen doorway, smiling as she watched them. She wore scrubs. She'd just gotten home from a long shift, but she looked relaxed in a way that had taken weeks to achieve. Those first few visits had been carefully orchestrated affairs. 1 hour on Saturday afternoons, with Charlotte present and Riley hovering protectively nearby. Declan had felt like a stranger in his own son's life, fumbling with toys he didn't recognize and struggling to understand the toddler logic that governed Lucas's world. But slowly, patiently, they'd built something new. Not the instant connection Declan had fantasized about, but something more real and more valuable. Trust earned through consistency. Love demonstrated through presence. "Papa home," Lucas had announced one Saturday, running to the door when he heard Declan's knock. It was the first time he'd used the word unprompted, and Declan had to excuse himself to the bathroom to compose himself. Charlotte had found him there 10 minutes later, leaning against the sink with tears streaming down his face. "It's overwhelming," she'd said simply, handing him a tissue. "The love. I cried for 3 days straight after he was born, just from the intensity of it." That was the moment Declan knew they were going to be okay. Not as a couple. That conversation still lay somewhere in the uncertain future. But as parents. As a family, however unconventional. "Daddy, look!" Lucas held up a toy truck, his face bright with excitement. "Fire truck!" "That's right, buddy. What sound does a fire truck make?" "Woo, woo, woo!" Lucas demonstrated with enthusiasm, making Declan laugh. These were the moments Declan treasured most. Not the grand gestures or milestone events, but the ordinary magic of a Tuesday evening spent building block towers and learning the sounds that emergency vehicles made. "Dinner's ready," Charlotte announced. "Lucas, can you help Daddy clean up the blocks?" "Yes, Mama." Lucas immediately began gathering blocks with the seriousness of someone given an important task. As they worked together, Declan marveled at how natural this felt now. The fear that had driven him away, the terror of inadequacy, of disappointing his son the way his own father had disappointed him, had been replaced by something simpler and more sustainable, the daily choice to show up. Some days were harder than others. Last week, Lucas had thrown a spectacular tantrum in the grocery store, and Declan had felt completely helpless until Charlotte quietly demonstrated the art of toddler negotiation. 2 weeks ago, Lucas had fallen and scraped his knee at the playground, and his immediate cry for Mama had stung more than Declan wanted to admit. But he was learning that fatherhood wasn't about being perfect, but about being present. Learning that love wasn't something you fell into, but something you built, day by day, block by block. "How was work today?" Declan asked Charlotte as they settled around her small dining table. It was another new ritual, these family dinners that felt both completely foreign and utterly right. "Long surgery. 6-year-old with a complex congenital defect. She'll be fine, but it took 8 hours." Charlotte looked tired but satisfied. "How was your day?" "Good. I had lunch with Mrs. Brennan to discuss expanding the reading program. She wants to add a weekend session for siblings who visit patients. It still surprised Declan how easily work talk flowed between them now. Not the competitive posturing of his corporate world, but genuine interest in each other's contributions to something larger than themselves. That's wonderful, Charlotte said, and her smile was warm with approval. The siblings always look so lost during long hospital stays. Nana Brennan, Lucas chimed in, recognizing the name. He'd met the volunteer coordinator several times when Charlotte brought him to the hospital, and had immediately adopted her as another grandmother figure. That's right, buddy. Nana Brennan thinks you're pretty special. After dinner, they moved through the evening routine that had become as natural as breathing. Bath time, with Lucas insisting that Daddy needed to hear about the adventures of his rubber duck. Story time, with Lucas choosing 3 books and curling up between his parents on Charlotte's worn but comfortable sofa. Bedtime, with Charlotte handling the actual tucking in while Declan stood in the doorway, still amazed that he was allowed to be part of this sacred ritual. Good night, Daddy, Lucas called softly from his toddler bed. Good night, Lucas. Sweet dreams. Charlotte closed the bedroom door gently, and they found themselves alone in the living room, a moment that had become both easier and more complicated over the past few weeks. They sat on opposite ends of the sofa, a careful distance maintained even as other barriers had slowly dissolved. He asked me yesterday when you were coming to live with us, Charlotte said quietly, her eyes fixed on her hands. Declan's heart stopped. What did you tell him? I told him that families come in all different shapes and that you have your own home but you love him very much and you'll always be his daddy. Good answer. Charlotte looked up at him then, her green eyes serious. Was it, though? Because I'm not sure I know what we're doing here, Declan. We're building something, but I don't know what it is. It was the conversation they'd been dancing around for weeks. The elephant in the room that grew larger every time he made Lucas laugh, every time she smiled at one of his jokes, every time they moved around each other in her kitchen with an ease that felt like muscle memory. I love you, Declan said simply. I never stopped loving you, but I know that's not enough anymore. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment. No, it's not, she agreed. Love is just the starting point. It's what you build on top of it that matters. Then let me build, he said, turning to face her fully. Let me prove that I can be the man you deserve, the father Lucas deserves, not the man I was before. I know he's gone, but the man I am now, the man you've helped me become. Tears gathered in Charlotte's eyes, but she didn't look away. It's scary, she whispered, trusting again, believing again. I know, but Charlotte, we're already building something beautiful. Look at tonight. Look at the past 3 months. We're not the same people who fell in love 3 years ago, but maybe these people could fall in love too. She reached for his hand then, her fingers intertwining with his for the first time since that night on the promenade. Maybe they could, she said softly. Through the baby monitor, they could hear Lucas talking quietly to his stuffed elephant, probably recounting the day's adventures in the serious whisper of a child who understood that nighttime was for quiet voices. Their son, their miracle, the little boy who had brought them back together not as the people they used to be, but as the people they'd chosen to become. We have time, Charlotte said, squeezing his hand. All the time in the world to figure out what this becomes. Declan brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. All the time in the world, he agreed. Outside, Brooklyn hummed with its nighttime rhythm. Inside, a family that had been broken was slowly, carefully, learning how to be whole. And in his bedroom down the hall, Lucas slept peacefully, surrounded by the love of 2 parents who had finally learned that the most important things in life couldn't be scheduled, strategized, or planned. They could only be lived, one precious day at a time. 1 year later, the autumn air in Central Park carried the crisp promise of winter. As Declan pushed Lucas on the swing set, the 4-year-old's delighted shrieks of, "Higher, Daddy, higher," echoing across the playground. Nearby, Charlotte sat on a park bench, one hand resting protectively on the gentle curve of her belly, watching her 2 boys with a smile that could have powered the city. Again, Lucas demanded as the swing slowed, his dark hair tousled by the breeze and his cheeks pink with excitement. One more time, then we need to check on Mama, Declan said, giving the swing another gentle push. She's getting tired these days. Because of baby sister? Lucas asked with the matter-of-fact curiosity of a child who'd been carefully prepared for the arrival of a sibling. That's right, buddy. Growing a baby is hard work. Charlotte watched this exchange with the quiet contentment that had become her default expression over the past year. The woman who had once flinched at unexpected sounds and worked 18-hour days to prove her worth had softened into someone who could sit peacefully in a park on a Thursday afternoon, secure in the knowledge that her family was whole. They were different now, all of them, scarred but healed, cautious but hopeful. They'd built their love back slowly, like archaeologists carefully reconstructing something precious from fragments. 6 months ago, Declan had sold his penthouse and bought a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, 3 blocks from Charlotte's apartment. Lucas had his own room there, decorated with the dinosaur wallpaper he'd chosen himself, but they still spent most evenings at Charlotte's place, moving between the 2 homes with the fluid rhythm of a family that understood that love wasn't about geography. 4 months ago, Charlotte had said yes to a proposal that came not with grand gestures or expensive rings, but on an ordinary Tuesday evening after Lucas had fallen asleep between them during story time. Declan had simply looked at her and said, "I want to spend every Tuesday like this for the rest of my life." She'd said yes before he'd even finished asking the question. 3 months ago, they'd discovered they were expecting their second child, a daughter who would grow up knowing both her parents from her very first breath, who would never wonder if she was wanted or loved. "Daddy, look!" Lucas called from the top of the playground's small slide. "I'm flying." Declan caught him at the bottom, spinning him around before setting him gently on his feet. "That was some serious flying, Captain Lucas." "Can we go see the ducks now?" Lucas asked, already running toward the pond where families of mallards glided peacefully across the water. As they walked, Lucas's small hand secure in his father's larger one, Charlotte fell into step beside them. Declan reached for her hand with his free arm, and for a moment they stood at the edge of the pond, a family of 3 about to become 4, watching the ducks navigate their own small world with graceful determination. "I used to come here," Charlotte said quietly, "when I was pregnant with Lucas. I'd sit on that bench over there and watch the other families, wondering if we'd ever have what they had." Declan squeezed her hand gently. "And now? Now I know we have something even better. We have a family that chose to fight for each other, a love that survived the worst thing that could happen to it and came back stronger." Lucas had found a stick and was attempting to get the ducks' attention, chattering to them in the serious tone he used when explaining important concepts to adults who clearly didn't understand how the world worked. "He's going to be an amazing big brother," Declan observed, watching their son's careful efforts to make friends with the waterfowl. "He's already practicing. Yesterday he read 3 books to my belly and explained to the baby that she needs to like trucks because trucks are very important." Declan laughed, the sound rich with joy. "Sounds reasonable to me." As the afternoon light began to fade, painting the park in shades of gold and amber, they made their way back toward the brownstone. Lucas rode on Declan's shoulders, pointing out interesting dogs and declaring his intention to befriend every pigeon in Brooklyn. Inside their warm home, because it was theirs now, not his or hers but theirs, they moved through the evening routine that had become sacred ritual. Dinner around the kitchen table that Declan had chosen specifically because it was big enough for a growing family. Bath time filled with rubber ducks and soap bubbles, and Lucas's elaborate stories about underwater adventures. Story time in the living room with Lucas curled between his parents on the sectional sofa that Charlotte had picked because it was comfortable enough for afternoon naps. "Good night, little man," Declan whispered as he tucked Lucas into his dinosaur-themed bed. "Good night, Daddy." "Good night, baby sister," Lucas added, leaning over to kiss Charlotte's belly with the gentle reverence of a child who understood he was talking to someone very special. Later, as Charlotte and Declan lay in their own bed, the first bed they'd ever chosen together, she traced lazy patterns on his chest in the darkness. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come to that gala?" she asked softly. Declan was quiet for a moment, considering. "I used to, but not anymore." "Why not?" "Because I don't think it was chance. I think we were always going to find our way back to each other. Maybe not the people we were before, but the people we became, the people who were brave enough to try again." Charlotte lifted her head to look at him in the dim light filtering through their bedroom windows. "You really believe that?" "I do. I think Lucas was always meant to be our son. I think this baby was always meant to be our daughter. I think we were always meant to be this family, even when it seemed impossible." She settled back against his chest, her hand coming to rest on the place where their daughter grew. "I love that you believe that. I love that you're here to believe it with me." Outside their window, Brooklyn settled into its nighttime rhythm. Somewhere across the city, other families were tucking their children into bed, Other couples were planning their futures. Other love stories were beginning or ending or finding their way through the complicated middle. But here, in this brownstone that smelled like lavender and baby shampoo, where crayon drawings decorated the refrigerator and toy trucks lived in careful harmony with medical journals, a family that had been broken had learned how to be beautifully, imperfectly whole, and in the morning, they would wake up and choose each other all over again, not because it was easy, but because it was worth it, because the best love stories weren't the ones that never faced obstacles. They were the ones that faced them and decided that love was worth fighting for, one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time. What would you have done in Declan's place? Would you have found the courage to rebuild a love you thought was lost forever? Your participation in this channel is very important. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below, letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.